Thanks for coming to my talk. This is kind of like being the opener for the Rolling Stones right here. This place is huge. Very cool. So thanks for coming to my talk, Open Core versus Proprietary SaaS, which to bet your startup's life on. The title's a little dramatic, but the idea is that as an operator of a startup, an early stage startup, what are the considerations you should make when trying to decide between Open Core versus SaaS, or is there even a decision to be made? So why do I care about this subject? I was the co-founder of a proprietary SaaS company called Mailgun, which was an email service for developers. That company was bought by Rackspace in 2012, was then spun out in I think 2015 or so, and is now a very successful independent company. And I had left Mailgun, which was in Rackspace, to start an open core company called Gravitational. So part of this is kind of my introspection into why did I do that? Why did I kind of switch teams between proprietary SaaS to open core? And the other thing that's always on my mind is at Gravitational, we actually help SaaS companies deliver their solutions on premise, whether that may be proprietary data server rooms or it could just be other people's cloud accounts. So we're constantly thinking about this dynamic between multi-tenant hosted SaaS and on-premise software or single-tenant software, and what are the advantages and disadvantages of each. So I'd like to take a step back and just kind of, for context sake, talk about why did SaaS emerge as this huge movement. And I may be dating myself, but perhaps some of you recognize that No Software logo, which was one of the more successful PR campaigns in the history of software done by Salesforce, and more specifically, Mr. Benioff. And so I think that signifies a big reason why SaaS became so successful, is there was a lot of pent-up frustration with the current offering, a lot of pent-up demand with commercial off-the-shelf software. And I think Mr. Benioff knew this through his experience as an Oracle salesperson. And so some of that frustration were pretty obvious, right? You had to get central IT involved, you had to pay a high upfront cost, you had vendor lock-in to deal with, and it was generally just a bad experience for the buyer of software. And so we all know that Salesforce is software. Like pragmatically, this doesn't make any sense. But the genius behind it is Salesforce said, well, we need to be something so different from the existing delivery model that this will work, and it did. The other thing that really enabled this SaaS movement was tech enablement, or like the why now question. So on the supply side, like what were some of the factors? One obvious one was the emergence of infrastructure as a software companies or cloud providers, right? So you could now match your revenue model to your cost structure and allow your customers to pay you over time and not have a huge capital inefficiency. And second, and I think why a lot of people are here today, is you could use a ton of free open source software to build your stack. So the proliferation of open source databases, everything from load balancers, basically, the LAMP stack, again, I'm dating myself, but you could build your whole SaaS on free software. And I think part of why people come to this conference specifically is, if you look at the history of the last 20 years or so, it's really a history of open source producing a ton of value, but SaaS capturing most of it. And so I'd like to talk a little bit more about like the dynamics of open core, and actually what is it? I think a lot of people are struggling to define what it is. I like the definition that Joseph Jacks came up, our host here. It's the existence of the company is dependent on an open source core. So at Mailgun, we used a lot of open source components, as I mentioned, but those components were interchangeable. So we may switch from like MongoDB to Postgres or Apache to Nginx, what have you. And it was really invisible to the end user. They didn't care, they didn't really know that we had switched technologies under the hood. Whereas a company like Elastic is dependent, their existence is dependent on Elasticsearch. Same thing with like Databricks and Spark. So that's kind of a good framework to think about it. The question that I'd like to answer in this talk a little bit is why now? So why is open core emerging? Is it even emerging? And what are the dynamics in place that were similar to the dynamics 20 to 30 years ago with SaaS? To do that, I'd like to make a couple assumptions. I'd like to talk about the ends of the spectrum between proprietary SaaS and open core. So I came up with this 2x2 matrix. which is on the x-axis method of delivery, so installable versus hosted, and then on the y-axis development model, so open source versus proprietary. And so I'd like to consider commercial or open core software in that upper left quadrant, and then SaaS in the bottom right quadrant. And I think there are real reasons to start there. If you want to start an open source project, there are good reasons to just put your code on GitHub, deliver an MVP of what you're doing, and see if there's traction, right? There's no reason to build multi-tenancy into it. There's no reason to host it if you don't know that anybody cares. And the primary value of what you're delivering is the openness and the permissive license and the fact that people can play with it and integrate it into their stack. And so it makes sense that you allow people to download it and use it how they wish. The primary value of SaaS is, again, the method of delivery. So it just works, right? There's no operational burden. And so why would I worry about open sourcing the code when, in reality, if you've ever worked at a SaaS company, the code behind the thing that just works is a jumbled mess. And if you open sourced it, people would have no idea how it even worked. There's no code commenting. So a lot of the best practices behind open source don't happen in the early stages of a SaaS company, nor should they. So there's reasons to start here. So with these assumptions in mind, I'd like to consider some of the benefits behind these two models. And I'd like to talk about them from both the buyer perspective and the vendor perspective, so the buy side and the sell side. These I talked about a little bit, but from the buyer's perspective, SaaS's value is really in the lower operational burden that me as a user needs to put forth. So I don't need to do anything. I log into my web app and it just works. On the flip side, as a commercial open source buyer, what I love is that the applications come to me generally, right? I don't need to upload my data, or I don't need to create data in your SaaS silo. I don't need to worry about what happens to it. I don't need to worry about integrating it across different SaaS providers. And then a complementary feature is that there's lower vendor lock-in. And so this, I put a question mark because if you're integrating anything into your stack, there may be some lock-in. But I think the data control that commercial open source gives you less vendor lock-in. And then obviously financial costs. So this is something that I consider as a buyer. What is my initial financial cost? And the real benefit to SaaS is that that financial cost is spread out over time. I'm essentially getting it financed by my vendor. And so these are some of the, I think, the big considerations as a buyer of really stuff in general, but software in particular, of what I consider. And these are the benefits of each. So there's no real clear winner. I think these things depend on the people you're selling to. So if you're selling to enterprise, they care about the things that are aligned with the commercial open source offering. And if you're selling to startups or smaller companies, they care about the things that SaaS happens to be good at. Now, if we consider this from the vendor's perspective, it's basically the flip side of that table, right? So me as a SaaS vendor or as a commercial open source vendor, these are kind of the things I've experienced, right? So as I'm producing my offering and I'm selling it and I have to operate it, with the commercial open source product, the beauty of it is that I just give it to you and you run it, right? Multi-tenancy is a big challenge, especially as you're scaling. Security, all these things take a lot of engineering talent and hours. And yes, if you're writing a great open source product, there is development, but there's no operational burden, or at least limited operational burden. So it's a huge advantage from a vendor's perspective. The downside is that I have very limited data visibility into what my users are doing, especially on the freemium or the open source side, right? So I cannot see the usage patterns. I cannot see the adoption in general besides like stars on GitHub or downloads. And so this is a real advantage as a SaaS vendor. So I can monetize it more effectively. I can come up with either time-based trials. I can see usage. I can base my pricing off of usage. And it gives me a real advantage from a monetization framework. Likewise, as a SaaS vendor, I actually like the fact that I have your data because it creates some vendor lock-in. So you are less likely to leave. because I have your data. And then finally, as a commercial open source or open core company, what we have really experienced, or what I've experienced in comparing these two, is I think our average contract value at Mailgun was something like, I don't know, 60 to 100 bucks a month for our customers. It was a typical SaaS model where you start at very low contract values, monthly pay, and what's different that we've experienced with commercial open source is you're selling into much larger companies. You're selling into people that are willing to pay you a larger amount upfront. And so it gives you much more capital efficiency. And you generally are able to use that. You're effectively funding yourself through your customer revenue, which is a great thing. So these are all some of the thoughts in my head as to like the differences between the two models. What I thought would be interesting is if we looked at some data amongst other companies out there. And so I chose S1 data because it's readily available and it creates a moment in time for all these companies that is generally a successful outcome. And so what I tried to do was look at a basket of companies that were comparable in the way they were approaching the market, so selling into like developers or enterprise, the DevSecOps market, things like that. Then I tried to look at relatively same IPO year, so 2017, 2018. I looked at IPO value around 1 to 3 billion, which had a corresponding annual revenue of 100 to 300 million. And then the average contract value of tens to hundreds of thousands. So we're not talking about companies like Slack, which is tens of dollars. We're talking about larger, more enterprise sales. And so what I tried to do is test some of those theories that we just talked about. And so the first one was lower operational burden means commercial open source companies should have lower cost of goods sold and thereby higher margins. To me, that makes some sense. And this is the data. So we have all the SaaS companies in pink, all the commercial open source companies in blue. And you can see in reality that is not the case. So we have Zscaler, which has very high gross margins, followed by MuleSoft, Anaplan, Elastic, so on and so forth. The names aren't that important. What's important is that there is this dispersion across the different types of companies. So it doesn't seem like that theory is correct. Then I thought, well, wait a minute. Commercial open source companies generally have more services revenue. So perhaps that business mix is creating lower gross margins for them. Luckily, they break out just product gross margins in the S1. And so we do see MuleSoft move to the left with a higher gross margin. But then we have Anaplan and Zscaler also fairly close to the left, and generally dispersion across all these different types of companies. So it's still not clear that open core commercial open source companies have, by default, higher gross margins. So I think we can say that that's not a valid assumption, or we need to dig more into it. One of the other assumptions was more usage visibility or data control should mean that SaaS companies have a more efficient sales machine. So the fact that I can monetize you more effectively because I can see your data, I can figure out the trigger points between freemium and paid usage, should mean that I'm more efficient in sales. And so we do see that Zora has a very efficient sales machine. I should define what this metric is, by the way. What I did was I looked at your gross profit and then your spend on sales and marketing. And so for every dollar you spend on sales and marketing, what increase in gross profit did you have? And so Zora did a great job with this. And then you have 2 commercial open source companies, 3 actually. So it's not clear that just because you're SaaS, you have a very efficient sales machine. One of my other assumptions was that higher vendor lock-in means SaaS should have better retention. Kind of makes intuitive sense. Again, we see a lot of dispersion here, right? So we actually have, this is a metric called net dollar-based retention. All of the enterprise public companies disclose it. It's usually in the first 1 or 2 pages, so you know it's an important metric. But it basically says, how is our existing customer base expanding? So it's both a sign of retention as well as growth within your existing customer base. So if you had low churn or high dollar expansion, these numbers would be good. And so we see Elastic and Cloudera have very good net dollar-based retention, followed by SaaS, followed by 2 commercial open source companies, followed by SaaS. So again, a lot of dispersion here, which means the conclusion that I made here may not be correct. Another assumption I made was that the fact that as an open core company or commercial open source company, I can charge higher initial revenue means that I should be more capital efficient. So I can fund myself through my customer revenue. We do see this is the case. So this is an IPO valuation divided by previous funding. So, and the IPO valuation I used here is basically the day before they went into the market. So what the bankers said your price was and gave all the shares to their friends before like the first day pop, right? So you do see here companies like Elastic, MuleSoft did very well on their valuation versus all their previous funding, signifying they were capital efficient. But then we have, again, 4 SaaS companies. So it's not clear that there is a benefit to either model in regards to this assumption. Another way to think about that is how much accumulated deficit did I use to get to a certain amount of revenue, right? So trailing 12-month revenue divided by accumulated deficit meaning like all of the losses I've had over time. And you see here, again, Elastic has done very well, but then we have 2 SaaS companies, and again, more dispersion as we go down. So there again isn't like one color to one side of the chart and one color to the other. So I don't know that I can make any conclusions there either. And then finally, does the public market have a preference of either type of company? And here's like the perfect dispersion, right? We have commercial open source, SaaS, COSS, SaaS, COSS, SaaS, COSS. So clearly, there's not one company that does, at least according to our assumptions, better in the public market. So this is wholly unsatisfying. I basically came to the conclusion that we can't make any conclusions. So then I started thinking about, well, why is that? And so I think it goes back to these assumptions we made. This may be the case when companies are getting started, right? That you are either open source and you're installable, or you're SaaS and you're hosted. And these things have benefits. So if my code is just out there on GitHub, I believe you generally have better awareness, or the possibility for better awareness, right? And likewise, it's harder to monetize that. But if I'm a proprietary SaaS, it's actually harder to get awareness, I believe. But I do have the benefit of making it easier to monetize. So what tends to happen as these companies grow older is that they start to realize the benefits of the other model. And so as an installable open source company, I start to think about, well, how am I going to make any money, right? Well, how I'm going to do that is I'm going to create some proprietary features, some of the crust around the open core, in order to charge for those things. And likewise, as a SaaS provider, especially in the developer markets, DevSec markets, in order to gain awareness, in order to establish trust with my buyers, what I tend to do, and we did successfully at Mailgun, is to open source some of our code, right? And these may be complementary things, but I'm generally trying to be a good member of the open source community because it is appreciated by my buyers. So you start to see some crossover here. Likewise, you may see additional crossover where a open source company or commercial open source company is starting to offer a hosted offering, right? So this may be single tenant versus multi-tenant, but effectively what is happening is that they are managing it for you, lowering that operational burden. Likewise, a SaaS company realizes that there's a huge market out there that will not use multi-tenant SaaS. So what they do is they take their SaaS offering and deliver it to their customers on premises. Now, on premises may be, again, the customer's cloud account. It doesn't have to be their data center in the current times. So this all muddies the water. And so by the time you get to like an S1 level company, the distinctions between those assumptions we made in the beginning and my assumptions are very different than reality. We can see this in the Elastic S1 data, they actually break out license and subscriptions in their gross margins. So if you look at that top line, you see their gross margins on just licensed software was like 98%, right? I mean, that's like a dream as a SaaS provider. And if you combine their subscriptions with their self-managed, it drops down to 77%. So the thought in my head was, well, why are these guys doing any type of managed or hosted offering if their gross margins are so high? And I listened in on their investor call, one of their quarterly calls, and it was clear that the CFO basically confirmed my assumptions, was that they see adoption happen quicker and retention higher on their hosted offerings, on their self-managed offerings. And so that's why they do it. So what are some of the conclusions of all this data and kind of my assumptions, my anecdotal assumptions? I think one, it doesn't actually really matter. Both proprietary SaaS and COSS business models can work and produce outstanding results. And where you start, you need to be cognizant of the benefits and costs of each model. But over time, you'll basically blur the lines between the two of them as a company. And the distinction dissolves over, as they mature. I also think if we go back to are the conditions right for open core to emerge as a SaaS, a movement as big as SaaS, or this huge movement? The real question is, do buyers want more transparency and more control enough so that they will take on the operational burden of managing it? And I think generally, even as a commercial open source company, if you are managing it, it's still, I think, more difficult currently for the buyer to operationally manage that. And on the flip side of that, on the supply or tech enablement side, the why now, the real question is, is the adoption of cloud native technologies and is the kind of merging of on-premise and cloud going to facilitate an environment where the operational burden actually doesn't matter that much, right? So is it easier to reduce that operational burden if it's just in your Amazon cloud account? If there is automation around it, like container orchestration tools, does that reduce the hurdle so that actually there doesn't need to be all that pent-up demand, and the difference is not that clear? And so finally, I think that the future is some combination of all those tables we had, right? So I don't know what you call this thing. I had called it private SaaS for a while in some of my blog posts. Some people, I think Joseph Jacks called it like commercial open source software as a service or something, open SaaS. Whatever. I guess the market will come to a determination. But the idea being that you have the best of all worlds, right? You have the lower operational burden because you don't have to. Basically, the technology is enabling or reducing or automating the operational burden that traditionally happened with open core software. You also get proper control of your data, so the applications come to you. Your data may be in your own cloud account, but the key is that the application's coming to you instead of you taking your data and putting it up in the cloud somewhere, or up in a SaaS silo somewhere. And then the lock-in is more tied to the problem being solved, right? So as long as my solution's being solved, I will continue to use this, but the switching costs are not outrageous. So it's not some arbitrary or artificial lock-in that I have to deal with. And then the price is proportional to the value being delivered. This is somewhat obvious, obviously there needs to be a meeting of supply and demand to a price. But I think that what I'm trying to get at here is there aren't any tricks or any predatory practices by the vendors to get you to pay more. So this is the ideal state. And something that actually we spend a lot of time at Gravitational is how do we achieve these things by unlocking the applications from their actual infrastructure? Like what if there was a world where you could deliver applications into anyone's cloud account on premises? What if the infrastructure was really commoditized to that point? So as I mentioned, a lot of these thoughts are in my blog, or our company blog, I should say. I've been thinking about this for several years, and it's great to see this conference happen to further think about these things. Also, all this data is in a Google spreadsheet, so if you want to email me, I'm happy to give you access to that. It's publicly available, so I can give you a link if you email me. And with that, I guess I have a few more minutes if there's any questions. Oh, yeah, one question. I think you need a mic. I don't know if there's a mic. I can hear you. You know, I didn't really look at that. I mean, I think it's something interesting to look at. I think some companies, it happens earlier than others. I think a lot of it has to do with kind of their path and traction. You know, I'm not sure exactly when Elastic switched over, but I think pretty quickly you realize that there's other markets available to you if you do make that transition to the other side. All right, thank you very much.